All right, so it looks like we're good with the recording here. All right, guys, so we're back here. So what I was mentioning, David, was that your story about Jeremy, right? Jeremy Craven, just reminded me of Coach Meek's teammate from college. She kind of had the same thing where her senior year, she was injured for at least a good 2 to 3 months, and all she was doing was pool workouts. But she was like having to put in like double time, and then her last race that she got to run at the Missouri Valley Conference, I think, was her. She ran the mile. She PR'd, and it was like her first time under 5 minutes. You know, so it just kind of shows that. I mean, sometimes you're stuck with what the situation is in front of you, but if you still utilize those tools and know what it is that you need to achieve, I mean, you certainly can still reach your goals.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I remember at Carthage reaching out to Jeremy, and once he told me his approach, I thought, okay, time to invest time into getting back into running. So over
Mhm.
the next couple of months during the early winter, I was hitting the pool for 2 hours on some of my quote unquote long run days. And then just, having intent when I was hitting the treadmill for any of my workouts, making sure that I was really focusing on my form in the pool. Because the worst thing you could do, honestly, is just, be on your phone and not really have that intent towards training. So
Mhm.
making sure that the same mindset you'd bring to running upstairs on the track is brought to the stationary or the lane you're stuck in for a few hours in the pool.
Mhm. Yeah. Um, so I think we got time here for a few questions here to kind of wrap things up for today. Um, so these come from your former teammate Donald.
Yep.
Um, well, I'll go ahead and read all the questions, and then you can decide which ones you want to answer. So he asked you, what were some of your pre-meet or pre-race traditions that you had? Maybe you could talk about one particular memorable race that you had, or some of the best ways to train for like a 5K road race.
Okay. So starting off with pre-race, one thing that I always heavily relied on was having the appropriate nutrition leading up to competition. So depending on when I was racing during the day, my usual approach would be 4 hours prior to competition. I would usually load up on a couple of bagels just so I
Mhm.
had plenty of carbohydrates. And then once I was done with that, couple of bagels, I'd start working on some fruit. So again, you're kind of getting a range there of complex carbohydrates as well as simple carbohydrates. Because the other thing I would also do is make sure that I'd be consuming plenty of fluids as well as some Gatorade mixed in with those fluids. And the reason why I did that was I knew it would be light enough on my stomach where if I tried to have a meal that had like a lot of protein, a lot of fat in it, it really just would upset my stomach. So it was a
Mhm.
light enough meal where, I was full, but by the time I was racing, it didn't feel like I had anything extra sitting in my stomach. So making sure that, again, I just had a pretty simple pre-race meal 2 hours beforehand, and then just keeping up with hydrating and downing a little bit of Gatorade. Then the other question in terms of what was it? Training for a 5K road
Y-
race?
Yeah, you can touch on that one, and then the last question was a memorable race that you had. But yeah, maybe talk a little bit about 5K racing, since you kind of talked about sort of pre-race, traditions that you had.
Mhm. So, in training for a 5K road race, one thing that I would always recommend, I know is more so towards the endurance side, but just kind of a point prior to that, always make sure that you are training in your flats on the surface you're going to be competing on. So,
Mhm.
flats are just that nice happy medium you have in between your trainers and your spikes. So, you're able to run a little bit faster since there's less weight, but it's not going to be as damaging as, let's say, spikes. So,
Mhm.
if you're able to run your workouts in flats and primarily do it on the streets, that's going to be really beneficial, especially if you could run it on segments of the course there. But
Mhm.
in terms of training, that would really benefit the endurance aspect of conditioning yourself for a 5K. What I always found to be significantly beneficial was hitting some longer LT workouts as well as
Mhm.
VO2 workouts. So for some people that's anywhere from, like, let's say an effort they'd be able to sustain for 20 minutes to maybe like their 2 mile pace in a race. So
Hmm.
hitting those paces on a regular basis is really beneficial. I always thought mile repeats was a pretty good indicator of how you would be able to perform in a 5K, especially since, at that point in the season, or in your training, I should say, you're doing them at, like, let's say for me, I was running them at 5 minute pace. That's a decent indicator for me that, okay, 5 minute pace is going to probably be my limit that I'll be able to sustain over the course
Hmm.
of a 5K. Since, mile repeats are going to be breaking them down, I usually break them with equal rests apart,
Hmm.
but then I can kind of give myself an idea. Okay, so 5 minute pace is going to be a little fast for me. Maybe tack on a few extra seconds, and I can probably anticipate running it at 5:10 pace the entire time. So again,
Hmm.
just having workouts where the repetitions have a little bit more volume to them, and being very smart in terms of how you're approaching recovery to those repetitions.
Yeah. I find that that is probably one workout, like, because every group, I felt like with cross country, every group kind of likes a little bit different workouts. Like for some reason, I find that just the varsity group likes some of the tempo, but I think they understand what you're trying to achieve at tempo, where sometimes maybe the younger groups who are just less experienced, they're doing the tempo workout, but they're not really tempoing. I mean, it's a little bit faster than what their easy pace is, but they're not really working that intensity level. But I find that the mile repeats is just like, it's a good go-to for every group, because like you said, it really does give you a pretty good gauge of like what you should be running for each of your miles during the race. And I think it just also kind of just gives you more confidence, because it is such a direct link to what you generally will do in a race.
And just expanding upon that confidence you just mentioned, whenever I do a mile repeat workout or 1200s or any kind of longer repetition workout, it's always a real good indicator for me how I'm supposed to run the race and how I'm supposed to feel. So obviously
Hmm.
that first repetition, if you go ahead and you kill it, you're going to be feeling it towards the end of that workout. Same thing as if you were to, let's say, go out faster than you normally would at the start of the race, you're going to be paying for it by the last mile. So really kind of envisioning where you're going to be at by the time you're competing in that mile repeat workout is another good way to kind of get you mentally ready on top of physically preparing for it.
Hmm. Yeah. Um, and it's interesting though too, because I really do think probably I mean the 5K really, when you break it down, because I remember reading that in the I did actually read Peak Performance, and it kind of gave you a general idea of, when you're running a 5K or 3 mile race. I mean, probably 95% of that race is aerobic. So, I mean, that's really what you want to be working as much, but there is still like a small component of, speed or anaerobic exercise. And it's kind of interesting because, like, I mean, I only ran cross country for 2 years in high school, and I dreaded the days of mile repeats. But anytime, because I ran at Downers North, so Will Kupish was my coach, and
Oh,
the
yep.
days that honestly he would, at the end of the year, which I wish he would, Coop, if you ever watch this, I wish he would have done this workout like all the time. But he would make us do like the 400 repeats, and as a sprinter who was being asked to run 75-second for 400s, but we would be doing, like, I don't know, 15. It was a lot of 400s. I mean, I could do that all day, but for some reason, like mile repeats, they just, I don't know. I don't know if I ever like mentally committed to the workout. So maybe that was my own fault.
Mhm. Yeah, it's definitely one where you need to be really patient in terms of performing each rep, treating them as
Mhm.
their own thing, and then realizing big picture what you're working towards.
Yeah. And I almost sometimes like it, at least for the new runners, I almost sometimes like the mile repeats, even though this is not what you're really supposed to do. You're supposed to run them about as even as possible. But sometimes I almost like it as a progression. So maybe you do have them start off something a little bit slower, and then just ask them to pick it up a little bit. And then after a while, they start figuring out that they could have gone a little bit faster. And then you start to see a little bit more consistency with the times across the entire workout.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So the last question, and then I have one for you to kind of wrap things up, was What is like your most memorable race? Good or bad? Which one stands out to you the most that if, someone asked you to tell you a detailed story of it, what would be your most memorable race?
So I'd say my most memorable good race was the 5K I ran at Chicagoland. So that's an invite that was usually held at North Central College,
Hmm.
and I ran that my sophomore year. So 2 weeks prior, I had just run a really good race tactically in terms of, being in the lead pack, but then as guys were falling off, just, moving ahead of them and just staying on the leaders, but not necessarily running with the leaders the whole time. So, that kind of set me up for when I ran my 5K. There was a big field with a lot of guys up front in the lead pack at the start, but as the race progressed, those guys started falling back, and I need to work my way up that lead pack. And it
Hmm.
got to the point where it was just me and the number one guy for maybe like the last 400 to 600 meters. And, that guy was able to just turn it on like something else at the very end there for the last 400. And I did my best to hang on. And when I finished that race, it was my first time under 16. It was, I think, like close to a 34-second PR. I ran 15:33 that day.
Hmm.
But the cool part was when I went over to my coach at the end and he showed me my splits, they were all within 1 to 2 seconds of each other. So I pretty much ran 37s that entire race. And there might have been one or two times where I hit a 36, a 38. So I
Hmm.
really didn't slow down that entire time, besides maybe picking it up a little bit towards the end there. And that just goes to show how a race can unfold, and having that level of consistency early on instead of, trying to be like in the lead pack too early and gassing yourself really does make a difference sometimes in terms of performing, but also that aspect of going out there and competing. This guy's falling back. That's a confidence booster for me. And I know where I need to be for the remainder of, this lap and this mile and the rest of the race.
Hmm. Um, so that kind of brings me to my last question that kind of wrap things up with. So, um, you can kind of look at it as two ways. You can either, you know, knowing what you know now, what would you have wished that you knew in high school as a runner? Like what would have helped you maybe even perform at a higher level?
Mhm. So, what I would say is obviously being able to limit the number of times I got injured. Because, like I said,
Mm-hmm.
the longer you're able to stay healthy, the more you're able to just build your foundation moving forward. So, if I was personally more knowledgeable about injury prevention, so let's say I was able to strengthen the muscles on my feet more and be able to have injury free senior year, I think that would have been ecstatic as well. But as well, my spring term senior year, I learned that, okay, you're not getting enough vitamin D. So being very cognizant of my nutrients as well as any kind of supplements I should have been taking so that my risk for injury was reduced as well. So being able to see a larger picture, like I said, in terms of injury prevention as well as appropriate kinds of nutrients. So making sure that I was able to hit those items out of the other 24 hour or the other 22 hours of the day outside of the 2 hours that would have been dedicated towards practice, I think would have
Mm-hmm.
been my main item I would have told a younger version of myself to focus on.
So, what do you think though that I mean, because I feel like I know Coach Caldwell probably like addressed that kind of stuff with you guys, but like, is that just something that you didn't necessarily take in yourself and do it? Do you feel like do you feel like I've even seen like in college, at least some universities, that they've even had, well, because mostly because athletes are on their own, right? And they have to like cook for themselves. So even at some schools, I've even seen teams bring in their, programs bring in their team and then they work with like, I don't know, dietitians or something like that. They actually literally show them like what their meal should look like.
Mm.
Do you think
So,
that something that would be beneficial, or what would you say for
so
like high school students?
the challenging aspect about that, and Coach Caldwell did a phenomenal job in terms of conditioning
Mm,
me, getting the most he could out of me with training, and like I said, getting me to
mm,
run 70-mile weeks over the
mm,
summer and performing as well as I did my senior year. But hindsight is 2020. So
Mhm.
let's say for the stress fracture injuries, unfortunately, the nature of stress fracture is it's a dull, it kind of comes on slowly. So at that point, it would have ultimately come down to me being on top of, or maybe even having been exposed to injury prior, where, all right, I
Mhm.
really need to build up the muscles in my feet. So those take more of the force and it's not going directly to the bones. And then for the vitamin D item, that was done with blood work. So
Mhm.
unless you're a student athlete at any
Mhm.
level who's able to have those kinds of resources, it's
Mhm.
really hard to know that right off the bat, especially since, stress fractures were something new for me. So
Mhm.
being able to say, oh, it's because of your diet, or maybe it's because of the muscles in your feet, those were the two factors that led to the couple of stress fractures I had during that time in my running career. But again, those are two very different areas. So having that knowledge now, I know for working with runners in the future, injury prevention, different from what we're doing in the weight room with strength and conditioning will be beneficial to athletes. But then
Mhm.
also emphasizing, with these running related injuries, how can I work with nutrition to kind of fill in some of the gaps that might form in the near future over the course of the athlete's career with me?
Mhm. Those are all good things because I feel like it's, it's just one of those, you get as an athlete, you get so caught up with, just like the physical training, but then, the recovery piece is probably even more important so that you're actually getting the benefits out of the training that you're doing.
Absolutely. And you kind of got to look at it too, how things played out. So my
Hmm.
first initial stress fracture, that was probably going to be more from the higher mileage than any kind of
Hmm.
vitamin D deficiency. Since I was coming
Sure.
off of summer training, I, had plenty of exposure to the sun over the course of the
Yeah.
fall. So unless
Yeah.
it had something to do with nutrients that I was taking in through my foods,
Right.
and then once we look at the second stress fracture, again, mileage wasn't going to be as high as it previously was, but I was coming off of the winter months, so it makes sense that a vitamin D deficiency would have been the culprit behind that injury.
Hmm. Yeah. I gotta tell you, you have a variety of knowledge, and I'm definitely going to be emailing you or texting you about some things as time comes up. But I want to thank you, David, for joining us today. Um, I think it's awesome that you were able to serve too as a coach for the DGS cross country and track program, and being able to give back to a program that, I think has brought you to where you are today. I mean. Um, we're very proud of you, and again, just can't thank you enough for joining us today. And best of luck to you with your master's program. And make sure you keep in touch and let us know what your next steps are.
That's much appreciated. Yeah, I mean, passing on the knowledge and really emphasizing growth, that's what I'm all about.
Mhm. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely.